So, okay, and recording. So, okay.
I have to say, this is the most streamlined I've ever seen.
Better record. When I read her short paper in 2019 that came out in the in the magazine, the scientific magazine Elements, where she was talking about using natural materials to essentially transform farm fields into a sponge for carbon dioxide, I got so excited about this idea. I just thought this was a wonderful idea. So here at Whitman, we've had the year-long academic theme, Climate Reckonings, Climate Justice. And my thoughts for a fantastic speaker turned immediately to Dr. Grace Andrews. But then I had to find her because she had left her previous position at the University of Southampton, although you may still be affiliated, I forget, to become vice president of Project Vesta, a for-public benefit company. And luckily, I tracked her down and she said that she would come speak about this very exciting technology, although it's a natural technology that is in development. So I am going to let her continue to introduce herself as we listen to her presentation on coastal enhanced weathering, a negative emissions technology. Thank you so very much for coming today, Grace. We're very excited to hear from you.
Thank you so very much for inviting me. It is always really a joy to speak with you, and your enthusiasm for this kind of work is so tangible. It excites me, and I work on it every day, and you get me excited about my own job. So that's really, I can't thank you enough for that. Okay, so I will get started. Share my screen. Famous words. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Nodding heads. Great. Okay. So yeah, coastal enhanced weathering, a emerging negative emission technology. So to start with, probably most of you are familiar with climate change, right? So atmospheric CO2 levels are going up. That's driving global temperatures up. And the outlook for the future isn't great right now. We have here some results from the most recent IPCC report, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the sort of global scientific body that generates reports every few years on our state of knowledge on climate change, its causes, its impacts, and what the future holds. And here it's showing you the global surface temperature change looking towards the year 2100 under a variety of different model scenarios. So in this bottom level one, this is assuming that we meet the goal of reaching net zero emissions by the year 2050. And this is the sort of temperature change we can expect to see on planet Earth if we meet that goal. On the other side of things, you have the model assumptions around we have doubled our CO2 emissions by the year 2050. And so this is sort of the worst case scenario that is being currently projected. And it has a really big impact on global temperatures, which one of these pathways we end up following. And beyond just temperature, the impacts of climate change and the sort of fallout from changing global temperatures, there are a myriad of consequences. So by increasing global temperatures, the oceans are absorbing more carbon dioxide as well. That's driving ocean acidification. Increasing temperatures are driving stronger hurricanes and storm surges. This is devastating flooding communities. We have rising sea levels. And some of these things are all also contributing to coastal erosion. This is destroying homes and livelihoods and habitats. So these things are already going on. These are all pictures of events at places where these impacts are already being felt around the world. And if we don't do something about climate change, these impacts are going to be dramatically worse. So when we think about climate change, full transparency, I'm stealing an analogy from Bill Gates on this one. But when we think about climate change and what it is we can actually do about it, we can think of our atmosphere as a bathtub, and the water that is in the bathtub is greenhouse gases. Now, we've been adding greenhouse gases to this bathtub, and the bathtub is starting to overflow. We're starting to see these consequences of overfilling our atmosphere. So what do we do? Well, we've really got two options. We can turn the spigot off, turn the water off. That means reduce our emissions. That means restructuring our society so that we're no longer so dependent on fossil fuels. This is a really huge task, but it's also absolutely essential. The other thing we can do is drain the bathtub. So we can actually take emissions out of the atmosphere. Now, strategies that are being developed on the second half, this idea of removing emissions, these are things called negative emission technologies or carbon dioxide removal strategies. And it's interesting, but up until recently, the idea of removing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere was something that's been talked about in the literature, but the overarching message has always been reduce emissions, reduce emissions, reduce emissions, taking emissions out of the atmosphere. Maybe that's just sort of saying to companies, you can keep polluting, you can keep emitting. We're just going to develop technologies that take it out, so we don't actually have to change anything. And there were sort of these negative attitudes about negative emission technologies as really just a crutch for polluters. What's really, really interesting is that as of a week ago, the IPCC report, again, this report, that's generated by scientists collectively around the world, our best state of knowledge about climate change, came out and said that the deployment of Cdr technologies to counterbalance hard to abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero emissions are to be achieved. And they said this with high confidence. This was a really big moment that happened a week ago, in that it was the first time it was made clear that the only way that we as society can get to net zero emissions is by actually implementing some of these Cdr technologies. So what does this landscape of negative emission technologies look like? Well, there are just about a million different ideas out there already. They broadly fall into these 6 categories I'm showing you here. So there are categories that think about taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it as organic carbon. So these are sort of technologies that fall into this top row. So reforestation is really a huge one, this idea of growing trees. But there are a variety of other ones. So growing organic matter in the ocean as well, storing carbon in soils as it's called biochar, pyrolyzed organic matter. There are other branches of negative emission technologies that focus on storing carbon dioxide as inorganic carbon. So this would be taking carbon dioxide, for example, and turning it into rock, limestone. These are the bottom row. There are negative emission technologies that take place on land. That's these 4 on the left. And there are categories that happen in the ocean. These are the ones on the right. And so there's a huge landscape out there, absolutely massive. But where I have spent my career is thinking about the types of technologies that fall into the bucket called enhanced weathering. And specifically right now at my company, I'm working on the type of technology over here called coastal enhanced weathering. So I called this talk Repurposing a Paradigm, and I'm going to take everyone back, maybe for your first time, to Geology 101 class. It's called Repurposing a Paradigm because the fundamental science that underpins coastal enhanced weathering, this technology that we're working on, is really based in the Earth's natural long-term carbon cycle. And so this is a picture of planet Earth and how it cycles inorganic carbon on the million-year timescale, and ultimately how the Earth naturally regulates its CO2 levels and therefore climate, again, on these very, very, very long timescales. This is the process that this will be the process that a million years from now is going to be what gets Earth back to its sort of steady state, its sort of equilibrium, and properly fixes everything that humans have done in terms of climate change. But it's going to take the Earth a while to get there. But basically how this works, and I'm going to try and break this down as easily as I can, is in the natural system, the source of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere really comes from volcanoes broadly. So you can think of volcanoes, they emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We've got it in the atmosphere as a gas. And that carbon dioxide, it can combine with water and it forms something called carbonic acid, right? And so again, the high level here, if you don't love chemical equations, is that carbon dioxide and water makes acid. And this happens anytime carbon dioxide and water come together. So every time it rains, this just happens. You form a very, very weak acid. Now that carbonic acid, one thing it can do is it can, as rain falls on mountains and such, and you get this process happening, it can react with what are called silicate rocks and minerals. So these are rocks where its fundamental structure is based in silicon and oxygen elements. And so it reacts with those minerals, those rocks. In other words, it dissolves them. And the consequence of that is you end up releasing a bunch of elements and compounds into solution. Some calcium, some silicon, some oxygen. And one of those things is this thing right here. It's called bicarbonate. And it is a dissolved form of carbon that's quite stable. And so again, in simple terms, when you dissolve certain kinds of minerals with acid, you end up making dissolved carbon, stable, lovely dissolved carbon. Now, again, on Earth's long-term time scale, this dissolved carbon and all these other bits and pieces, silicon, oxygen, make its way to the ocean. And in the ocean, that dissolved carbon can recombine with calcium and form the shells of marine organisms. And ultimately that gets turned into limestone rock. So dissolved carbon and calcium, you get rock, and eventually that limestone rock gets subducted, melted basically, and that CO2 gets re-released. And so this is the cycle that Earth goes through. And our sort of net process here is we started with a gas, we started with carbon and a gas, we turned it into a dissolved form and eventually into a rock. So you had two phase changes here. So this is how the Earth does it. It's a very, very lovely process, but it takes a really, really long time. When we think about how can we address climate change, which happens on the timescale of decades to centuries, this process is not going to cut it for us. But as scientists, we ask the question, is there a way that we can speed up just a part of this process so that we can have an impact on climate change? Can we harness this natural mechanism? And so in this case, our CO2 is coming from factories and cars, things like that. And what we're interested in is not necessarily forming limestone on the ocean floor, but basically just getting that CO2 that was in the atmosphere into the ocean as a form of dissolved carbon. Because like I said, that dissolved carbon is quite stable. It's stable for thousands of years, which is certainly long enough to help us fix climate change. So that's the idea behind enhanced weathering. Now, it's an interesting question. So how do you, even if we're just thinking about this one piece of that carbon cycle, how do you speed up something that usually takes hundreds of thousands of years? And how do you speed that up to the timescale of decades? And the good news and the bad news is there's really only so many lever arms on this system. There's only so many things you can change, which makes the problem both simple, but also difficult at the same time. The first thing you can do is you can focus your attention on trying to weather or trying to dissolve not any kind of silicate mineral, but really only certain specific ones. So there are certain minerals that dissolve faster than others. This is just a plot of different minerals, normal common minerals, and their relative dissolution times. So there are some minerals down here at the bottom that dissolve a whole lot faster than other ones like quartz. So we can think about using silicate minerals that dissolve very, very quickly relative to some of the other ones. And so the fastest dissolving silicate mineral out there is something called olivine right here. So we can focus on olivine. We can also take that olivine and grind it up into really small pieces. So the smaller you grind something up, the more surface area you're creating. The more surface area you're creating, the more just area there is for that acid to react with. So you dissolve faster. This is the plot of the percent of olivine dissolved for different sized particles over the course of 100 years. And what this is showing us is that, for example, for a sort of sand-sized grain, after 100 years, maybe you've dissolved 15% of it. But if you have the size of that grain of sand, suddenly after 100 years, you've dissolved 70% of it. So making those grains really, really small has a big impact on how much you can dissolve and how quickly. The last thing you can do is really try and work in low pH environments. So that's just another way of saying very acidic environments, and high temperature environments. So both of these things, both of these parameters makes just about anything dissolve faster. If it's hot and if it's acidic, you're going to dissolve things. And so this is, again, just a plot of the range of pHs out there, range of acidity. So over here is more acidic, over here is more basic. And the more acidic you get, the faster that dissolution rate is. And it has a pretty big range. This is a log scale. So this is orders of magnitude. So you want to be as acidic as possible. So these are really our lever arms. These are what we can change. These are what we can control. And so when we pull all of this together, the question is, okay, we know what we want to, we know our product. How do we actually do this in the real world on large scales? And the answer that we have come up with, we and other academics out there as well, it should be very clear on, is this idea of coastal enhanced weathering. And basically what it means is we want to add some olivine sand to coastlines and then basically let it weather. And in that way, capture carbon. This is working with the mineral that we want to work with. It's grinding it up really, really small. It's adding it to a place where there's a lot of water and a lot of carbon dioxide, so you're going to get a lot of acid. The sediments here, when you actually get in there with organic matter and things like that, you can get really acidic. And so you can do this in warm water environments down in the equator, for example. So there are lots of ways you can try and optimize around these controls. So this is the idea. This is really the whole thing. It's a technology, but honestly, it's not that technological in the way that it captures carbon. It is truly adding sand to coastlines and then letting it do its thing. There is a really, really important co-benefit to this idea, though. So, like I said, one of the major consequences of climate change is that we're getting coastal erosion, and this is having really tremendous impacts. You know, today in the U.S., we add 37 million cubic yards of sand to US coastlines every single year to try and combat the coastal erosion that's going on. That number is only going to go up as sea level rise gets worse. So this is a huge problem, and we are already implementing a massive, massive industry around just protecting our coastlines. And so in general, the idea here is we as a society are already adding huge amounts of sand to coastlines to protect ourselves. And so at Vesta, when we think about all this together, our idea is really, as a company, as an organization, we're interested, of course, in removing excess carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere. And to do this, we want to add algae and sand to coastlines. And our idea is that we can both mitigate climate change, so address the root cause of things like sea level rise, while simultaneously contributing to climate change adaptation through coastal protection. Coastlines need sand. We want to put sand on coastlines, and the sand we want to put there will actually help fix the underlying problem. That's the vision that we have. So what is sort of the roadmap for this technology, both in our company, but also in the academic and research sphere? It's the same. How do we get there? How do we get from an idea to large scale impact? Well, it starts with foundational research. So we have to think really carefully about safety and the sort of understanding, is there even theoretically the possibility that this could have impact? What is the theoretical efficiency of carbon removal? From there, we have to actually go out and try it. So we have to do what are called pilot projects, really small scale, highly controlled, heavily monitored projects in the real world to assess what is the real world efficiency of carbon removal, but also thinking about things like social license. Do people want us to do this? Is there informed consent for this kind of technology? And of course, economic viability. Frankly, can you build a business model around this? Which is important because people will only implement this if there is the financial resourcing to do so. And then ultimately, the last step of this roadmap is, of course, larger scale projects and ultimately climate mitigation. So I'm going to walk you through some thoughts on each of these sort of components about bringing this technology into the real world and sort of show you what this roadmap looks like in reality. Starting with foundational research. So people have been looking at coastal enhanced weathering in the academic literature for maybe about 15 to 20 years now. So there's a lot of stuff out there on it. High level, the early modeling results that people have generated suggest that it does in fact have potential for large scale impact. So modeling studies have suggested that it could capture as much as 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by the end of the century if it was deployed only in the ice-free coastal waters of the Earth. So that would be about 8.6% of the ocean, which is both a lot, but also I think is a scale that reflects the scale of the climate crisis. For context, I'm just sort of reminding everyone that to hit our sort of climate goals by the end of the century, we need to be thinking about, on the magnitude of 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere. So this is not going to be a silver bullet that fixes all of our problems. This is something that, would be a contribution to a very large problem. But there are, even following on these early studies, there are refinements that need to be made in our understanding. Oops. So some of the things that we think about in terms of the geochemistry behind this are, how does that theoretical efficiency of carbon removal change under different settings? So let's get a more complex understanding of what that removal rate is. How does it change when you move from warm equatorial waters to more temperate waters like you get off of the US? What happens when the native sand in any of the beaches that you might be putting the olivine on, that sort of native material has a different composition. So quartz sand beaches that are common in the US versus the sort of carbonate beaches you might get in the Bahamas. They have very different, they're very different minerals, and so they can have very different chemistry. How does that impact carbon capture? What happens when you're working in high energy versus low energy wave environments and the grains are being mixed together? How does that impact how quickly those grains are dissolving? All of these things add layers of complexity to our understanding of carbon capture, but we need to understand these complexities to really assess how that works in the real world. The other really big key piece of foundational research focuses on marine ecology. So what are the impacts, either positive or negative, on marine life or their environments? So there is, we can learn a lot sort of anecdotally from natural analogs. There are places in the world where olivine, this mineral olivine, is found on beaches. It's actually a relatively common mineral. I should say that Washington State actually has like the biggest operational olivine mine in the US. So it's really common in Washington, of all places. But there are places, but it's usually, I'll say, a sort of a one mineral, one component of sand. But there are places in the world, like in Hawaii, where it's a huge component of sand. It makes up 40% of the sand on a beach called Papakalea in Hawaii, and it gives it this really bright green color. To be clear, we're not proposing that we build beaches of 100% or even 40% olivine. We're not proposing that we turn beaches green, but this gives us sort of an end member scenario, right? So what happens to the environment if you have a beach that's 40% olivine? So this is a really interesting case that we're actually going to be going out and studying this summer, to better understand that. And actually, Kirsten will be joining us, so which is really great. But we can also learn from other places where olivine has been added artificially to the marine environment. So interestingly, it's actually used in pollution remediation. Trace metals can adsorb to the outside of olivine. And so if you have sort of heavy metal contamination, like what occurs in some harbors around the world, people have added olivine sand to the harbors to try and adsorb or take on some of these heavy metals. And they've done really thorough monitoring studies of those places. So we can learn a lot from these environments and the sort of environmental monitoring that they've done. And in general, everything so far, these sorts of this sort of understanding and other academic papers point to safety, that this will be safe for the marine environment. But obviously, this is of utmost importance in terms of making this a meaningful technology. So something that at Vesta we've focused on is really trying to fill in some of the knowledge gaps around the safety of olivine sand in marine environments. We've been working with an EPA accredited lab using EPA protocols to test different marine organisms that live in sand. So these are called benthic organisms that actually live in the sand in 100% olivine sediment. So again, not that we're proposing to build 100% olivine beaches, but again, the idea here is this is an end member. This is a worst case scenario. What does living in this end member worst case scenario look like for marine organisms? So we've done these sort of EPA standard experiments on polychaete worms, these little guys that live in there, and amphipods also living in the sediment with a variety of different endpoints. So assessments, so survival and growth. We did an olivine treatment and then a control treatment with just natural sediment. And what we found was no statistically significant difference between these groups. So no negative impact or positive impact for that matter, no impact at all. So that's just to highlight some of the things we're thinking about. But really the next step is to focus on pilot projects. So it's just true that you can do all the modeling and laboratory studies in the world, and you'll never really know how something works until you just go out and try it in the real world, again, in a very small scale setting, highly monitored and highly controlled. And so that's really the next phase of the research around this technology. This is something that has never been done before. And we at Vesta are really excited because we believe we'll probably be the very first group that gets regulatory approval to actually go out and do a pilot of coastal enhanced weathering. So some of the pilots that we're excited to be spinning up, we have one that hopefully, fingers crossed, will be launching this summer in New York, here in the US. The idea for this project is, again, to see if we can fold coastal enhanced weathering into a coastal protection project. So this is a picture, bird's eye view of a really small community. These are the houses down here at the bottom. It's a beach that's about 10 houses long. So this is about 1,000 feet and 1,000 feet of coastline. And this is a community, again, that's facing coastal erosion issues, is funding their own coastal protection project out of their pockets. And they're putting down about 15,000 cubic yards of nourishment material this coming summer. And for context, 15,000 cubic yards of material is a very, very small amount. But what we're coming in and doing is we'll be adding 650 tons of olivine over just 2/3 of that project area, such that the olivine itself will be about 5% of the project volume. And we are going to monitor the site, both in the project area that doesn't have olivine, in the project area that does have olivine, and then outside of the project area altogether. And so we'll have sort of two controls on our experiment, both just undisturbed and then disturbed without olivine. So right now we've got permits from the New York Department of State and the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. So feeling really great. We're awaiting US Army Corps approval. We've heard that we'll have soft approval from the Army Corps. So they verbally said that they think it's going to happen, but we don't have it yet, but we think we're really close. So this would be really exciting first deployment in the US. We are also spinning up a field pilot in the Dominican Republic. This is a really interesting one, again, because it has so many of the sort of climate parameters that we think could be really great for weathering. So it's got that really warm water year round. That should be really tremendous for dissolution rates, for example. But our design here is a little bit different than in the US. So here, what we found, we identified two little pocket bays that are about 500 meters apart. They're really close. They're each very small, about 1 hectare each. They've got similar ecological and geomorphological conditions. So the same sorts of seagrasses grow in both, for example. And the idea here is that we'll have here one bay as a control site and one bay as a treatment site, where we're going to add about 200 tons of olivine over the course of about 2 weeks, which will end up being a total of about a 1 centimeter layer thickness. So really, really incrementally adding it so that we're not overly disturbing the site at any particular point in time. And we want to make sure that all the benthic organisms and such have an ability to adapt to these very micro amounts of olivine addition. Right now, we have built a research station in the Dominican Republic where we are doing a baseline monitoring program. So the idea here is we want to study both of these bays, their chemistry, their ecology, their sediment transport really, really carefully over the period of about 6 months to a year, so that we have just a tremendous baseline against which we can observe any change once we add olivine. So we've installed a MET tower that measures basic MET parameters. We've got what are called sondes installed in the actual ocean, which measure things like pH and temperature and salinity of the seawater. We're collecting water samples and sediment cores, and basically developing models of the area so that it's really well understood. In general, in both of these sites, but our monitoring program, to give you a flavor for what that looks like, in waters, we're measuring your sort of basic parameters, pH, temperature, salinity. We're also measuring some of these carbonate system parameters, nutrients, things that turbidity that tells you sort of the cloudiness of the water. We're collecting cores of the sediments, so looking at any changes in the minerals in there. Are we changing the composition of the beach? Is the olivine distribution changing? That sort of thing. And then, of course, looking at the ecology. We really want to understand if there are any ecological impacts. So we're monitoring for changes in the abundance of particular species or the distribution of species, and various other parameters. So our overarching goals in these pilots are two: to quantify carbon removal and quantify ecological impacts. Part of quantifying carbon removal is to think about the kinds of carbon emissions that are produced to implement a project. So it's certainly true that there is a cost to doing all of these. And the greenhouse gas costs come from 4 different areas. So there is, of course, the mining of the olivine sand. There is the grinding of that olivine sand into small sand-sized grains. That takes energy. It's transporting it from the mine to the project site. And then there are emissions associated with spreading that material on the beach or in the coastal environment. All of these things release CO2 to the atmosphere. And this is only going to be a successful technology if the amount of carbon that we capture significantly outweighs the carbon that's emitted in order to actually implement the project. And so these are the numbers, the actual numbers of our what's called a life cycle assessment for the project, the field project in New York. I've normalized it to 1,000 tons of olivine, but it gives you a flavor for really where most of your emissions are coming from. And without a doubt, in this case, they are coming from transportation. So we are emitting a lot of our carbon, getting that olivine from the mine that it's going to be sourced from, in this case, a mine in Norway, all the way to New York. And part of why these emissions are so huge is because at this really small pilot scale, it's just a really inefficient shipping route. And so even all of this together, the LCA works out that the project should be about 86% efficient. What that means is that of this sort of initial about 800 tons of carbon dioxide that this should capture, we keep about 86% of it, that we lose about 14% of it to the emissions to actually implement the project. So it's pretty good. 86% efficient is pretty good. When you actually, adjust for the fact that in New York, we're only putting down 650 tons of olivine, it suggests that this project is going to capture about 450 tons of CO2, which is equal to the annual emissions of about 100 cars. So it's not a lot, but again, that's not really the goal of this project. The goal of this project is a sort of proof of concept. Climate change mitigation will come with time. And in general, it's important to keep in mind that these numbers will be different for every single project, right? So in every project, the size of the olivine grains is going to be different because it's going to be compatible with the local environment. The transportation distance is going to be different. So these emissions are going to vary widely. Even the spreading of the olivine in different places, you're going to use different equipment. So these emissions will change. And also the capture that you get, again, in any environment is going to be a little bit different. So warmer waters versus colder waters, those kinds of things. But we've run a series of these calculations. And in general, what we find is that you capture about 5 times more CO2 with a project than you emit to implement it. So in general, it seems promising in that respect. The last thing I want to touch on with just field pilots is the importance of the opportunity that they give to really think about social license and social acceptance. And so at Vesta, we have a whole branch of our company that's focused on social science. And we very much acknowledge that when it comes to climate change, not every voice in the world is heard equally. And we are doing a project in the Dominican Republic, as I said, and it was of utmost importance to us, particularly at that pilot site, that the community that lives and works around the project site was a participant in the project and was able to make informed decisions about their interest in having the project executed. So we have a full-time social science staff that lives in the DR or from the DR, and we have been conducting stakeholder mapping and surveys. So our aims for this were to understand the socio-demographic profiles of the local community around the project site, to understand their current knowledge and attitudes towards climate change, and then ultimately by doing first sort of these baseline surveys, and then in the future more surveys and mapping after we've had a presence, to be able to measure any influence of our interventions, of our actual research, or just the socializations of having our project team at the site. So just some of the preliminary results that we've gotten from these surveys I wanted to share. It is interesting just to even ask this question, before the survey, had you heard of climate change? For 25% of the community, the answer was no, right? Attitudes about what has caused the increase in atmospheric temperatures, everything from human activity to religious figures, natural causes. These are all are a major part of the understanding of climate in that region. How do you think the frequency or intensity of hurricanes and storms has changed in the DR in the last decade? This is really a big one. Hurricanes and storms are a big part of life in the DR, and understanding how people are thinking about it is important to their understanding of what we're trying to, why are we there? What are we trying to accomplish? And so these are just some of the initial results we've been getting. And in general, we've been having just really great interactions with the local community around the project site. They've been really involved as we want them to be, and really taking a sense of ownership in the project. When we've had situations where some of our sensors and wells got swept away in a big storm, and the community is out there grabbing up our gear for us, texting us, WhatsApping us photos and pictures, giving us updates on, how clear the roads are for access, these sorts of things. So really interested in the project, excited about the project, and taking ownership in it, which has been tremendous to see. And so in just my last 2 minutes, I wanted to talk about, again, thinking about scale and how we should this technology prove to be safe and efficient, how do we actually have real impact? So I highlighted this earlier, but 37 million cubic yards of sand placed in the US annually to begin with. When we look at this at Vesta, we see that this really represents an immense and existing opportunity to have this kind of olivine sand drive impact. If we can work with this industry that already exists, this coastal protection industry, we can leverage it to drive impact very quickly. The benefits of this are that the infrastructure for actually placing sand in coastal environments, it's already there. It also means that there's no land use change, right? We're not adding sand to a place that wouldn't have sand additions anyway. So there's no additional sort of physical impact there for recreational use or anything else like that. That also minimizes environmental impact. It is simply true that if you go into a coastal environment and you add sand to a beach, you can drive what's called benthic smothering. So benthic organisms that live in that sand, they've now been covered up and they can be smothered. And there's a whole world of literature out there that shows sort of what the timescale for recovery is, typically somewhere in the world of 3 months to a year. But anyway, if we can come in and add our sand as part of projects that are going ahead anyway, we can minimize that environmental impact. No additional environmental impact above and beyond what's going on anyway for protection reasons. And for us, it also means there's an existing regulatory framework that we can leverage. one of the biggest challenges with Cdr Technologies right now is that, frankly, how do you get a permit for a technology that doesn't exist, right? Like when you submit a permit, you're asking a regulator to assess whether or not this is going to be safe and necessary. That means there is a relative benchmark that they should be assessing your project against. If it's never been done before, what do they have to assess you against? It's a real challenge. It's a real challenge trying to develop a regulatory framework for something new. What's really nice about coastal enhanced weathering and having it merged with the coastal protection industry is that there is a framework out there for assessing whether or not materials that are being added to or used for coastal protection projects are safe. You know, are they meeting environmental regulations? Are they going to be beach compatible, et cetera, et cetera. So we can work within that and sort of skip over this actually, frankly, immense challenge of developing a regulatory framework. And that is going to be a major step towards speeding up large-scale deployments. The last thing here is that, you know, the business model behind coastal enhanced weathering is ultimately, you know, we place olivine sand on beaches, it removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We quantify that carbon, we go out, that carbon removal, we go out, we make measurements, we document it, and then we can sell carbon credits based on the amount of carbon we removed. Through this business model, what it means is that, you know, basically the price of that olivine sand is being paid for by the carbon credit sales, which means that sand can be provided to coastal communities who are doing coastal protection projects. We can give them that sand for free. And that really opens new doors to resourcing these vital projects. This is a really significant impact, actually, because, you know, in the US today, if you are having erosion problems on your coastline, you can apply for federal funding or state funding, and you submit an application. Basically, the government assesses whether or not there is enough economic gain from helping you versus not helping you. And so there's a bar you have to meet in order to get federal funding. And a lot of communities, small communities, don't make that bar. And so in order for them to have these coastal projects implemented, they pay for it out of pocket by having their community taxes raised. And so this is a really significant burden that's being placed on coastal communities because of the decisions that are being made by companies, by governments, right? Not by them. And so if we can come in and say that, you know, we can pay for, say, 10% of the sand that you need for your project, that has a really meaningful impact to communities. So this is one of the things I really love the most about this strategy. And then just the last thing I'll say in two minutes, it's just a comment on policy, because nothing will ever get to scale without some policy adjustments. I highlighted here again, just this recent statement about the need for CDR that came out in this IPCC report, which is the report that policymakers use to understand climate change and climate impacts. That came out on April 4th, and on April 8th, the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act was introduced to the federal legislature. This is an act that basically would require the attainment of carbon dioxide removal through Cdr Technologies. So this is, for me, shows the very direct impact that these sorts of policy documents or scientific documents can make on actual policy, right? So this is an act that requires federal government to remove carbon dioxide through Cdr technologies. It ensures the best practices for carbon accounting, and it incentivizes technologies like the ones Vesta is developing by basically guaranteeing a demand stream, right? It helps us know that there will be somebody who buys our carbon credits at the end of this very, very long R&D timeline, because we're spending a lot of time and effort and money trying to develop a technology. It's important for us to know that at the end of the day, there's going to be someone there who wants to buy into this and invest in it. And these kinds of policy acts are essential to making that happen. So, go vote, basically. Okay, that's all I had to say. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
All right, classroom team, who's got a question? All right.
What? Oh, hi, I'm Allie. I guess I'm wondering, like, how do you know if it's working? So at some of these test sites, like you were saying, obviously it's easy to like look at some of the ecological like impacts or some of like the impacts to like sea life or plants in that space, but how do you know if like carbon capture is like actually happening at a rate that's like notable or worth like scaling up, I guess?
Yeah. By measuring it, really. Yeah, so it's interesting, but I emphasize that the technology side of this, the carbon capture part of it is not really technology at all. That's just the Earth doing its thing. The technology part of this comes in with how do you actually quantify this in the real world, right? Ultimately, we are removing at any given instantaneous point in time, we're removing a really small amount of carbon dioxide. And so, it is the major question in the sphere of technologies. How do you measure that in real time? What kind of sensor developments do we need to make? Exactly what parameters do we even want to measure to begin with? That's actually not totally straightforward. But in general, what we're doing and what this field of technologies is doing is moving towards identifying, which of the carbon system parameters give you the biggest signal. So there are a bunch of different ones. There are things like alkalinity, which is actually the name of the dissolved carbon that I talked about at the very beginning. But then you can also just measure things like pH, which are directly impacted by these things. So, a major goal of these field trials is to figure out which of the different olivine dissolution product parameters is the most measurable and in what reservoirs. Can you measure it in the seawater or can you measure it in the sediments? Can you measure an air sea flux exactly? These are actually the questions. This is what I lose sleep over every night is trying to answer this exact question. And right now, the best I can say is we're going to try and measure everything. That's the goal. We're going to go measure everything. Massive sampling project, looking at every reservoir we can, every parameter we can, and measuring it on the most high precision instruments that are out there in the world, the most state-of-the-art instruments. And then we're going to spend a lot of time making sensors, I think. Yeah, tiny sensors that can be deployed in the ocean. Yeah.
I have a question about just like how sustainable it is to keep the olivine there, or if you worry about it getting washed away. I would imagine a big part of putting it on the coast is the high energy of the waves. And I would wonder if you would have to keep resupplying it with olivine because it would get lost into the deep ocean, or if you don't really worry about that.
Yeah, so we definitely do think about the transport of the olivine. It's not going to stay in one place. I mean, it will erode just like the sand on those beaches right now is eroding. It's gonna follow the same trajectory. The one nice thing is that as long as that olivine is in the water, it's doing its job, right? You just need olivine, carbon dioxide, and water, and you're gonna get this reaction to go. So to some extent, it doesn't worry me about, if a year down the line or 5 years down the line, it's moved away from the place that I put it, because I know that it's still going to be in the ocean. And so you can project forward. Basically, you can run a monitoring program for that first year or 2 years or 3 years when that material is still largely in place, and then project forward the carbon capture rates, even once it moves away.
Hi, my name is River. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I was wondering if there have been any studies related to the impact of adding sediment on reef systems, particularly coral reef systems.
Yeah, great question. So in general, for lots of reasons, people don't add sediment directly on top of reefs. And I don't think anyone has an interest in smothering reefs. That said, people certainly add sediment, nearby and sort of around reef systems. One of the things that is actually another sort of co-benefit of this technology is that, again, when you run this reaction, this chemical reaction, and you create that form of dissolved carbon called alkalinity, that alkalinity is actually the sort of antidote to ocean acidification. So it counteracts ocean acidification. So it's good for the ocean in other ways too, particularly for corals, for example. So ocean acidification's been a really big problem there. So the hope is that this will actually be beneficial to corals. All that said, this is a part of our research program. So we have collaborations going right now studying the impacts of olivine sand in tanks with corals and looking at any, whether or not you actually do see a measurable impact to corals following the addition of olivine. So it's something we're thinking about, and I'm optimistic about that this could be something that has yet another sort of dual co-benefit for the marine environment.
Hi, I'm Reed. Naomi's question kind of got me thinking. So if the olivine's taking carbonic acid out of the ocean, like the acid that's already in the ocean, right? Would it be possible to like extend the project to just dumping olivine in the ocean? Like, why do the coasts matter, I guess is my question.
Yeah, that's a great, very insightful question. A lot of people are talking about just adding it like sort of further out in the ocean. There are some reasons why we think it's going to work best in the coastal environment. So one is that we do think that the sort of action of waves and currents is going to be important for sort of, you can imagine, circulating the water around the olivine grains to sort of refresh it and recharge it and make sure that that reaction keeps going. The waves and tides can also physically grind the olivine grains against themselves and help break them down into even smaller pieces, which further increases that surface area and again can make that reaction go faster. And then there are so those are some reasons why we think waves and tides can be beneficial to keeping that reaction going as quickly as possible. There are other considerations though as well. So a big one is that in order for this to work in terms of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, you have to run this reaction in the seawater, and then basically that seawater has to come back into contact with the atmosphere to actually draw the CO2 in, right? And so if you do this out in the deep, deep ocean, the ocean has different sort of layers to it, and the deep bottom waters of the ocean, they sort of circulate along the bottom of the ocean and they're not directly mixing and in contact with the atmosphere. And so if you were to add olivine sand out in the deep ocean, it would kind of just like sink to the bottom and the reaction would happen down there, but you wouldn't actually draw CO2 out of the atmosphere because you would never get that return of the seawater back to the surface for, thousands of years. Basically, you'd have to wait for the whole ocean to circulate in order for it to come back up, like up at the North Pole. So yeah, there are lots of reasons that people, it's interesting. People do talk about it in that, what if you grind that olivine so small, like fine dust, and then sprinkle it in the ocean and it'll dissolve so quickly, it won't even get to the bottom. Can you do that? That's something people think about. People are working on that as well.
We have more questions in the room, but I want to make sure I check this question in the Q&A. Neve Fleming, hopefully I'm saying that right, says, how do you decide which beaches? How does this work on a global scale, meaning who will have access to this technology? Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I mean, for right now, we are working in places where there is need for sand, communities that are interested in working with us. These are pilot projects. And so it's
it's not for everyone. Not everyone is interested in having a technology tried out on their beaches for the first time. Not everyone believes in climate change, right? So it's not for everyone. So right now we're really focusing on places where we have community support, and also trying to optimize for beaches where we think this reaction could work the best. We're trying to create conditions for sort of best case scenario, since this is really our proof of concept phase. So yeah, that's sort of where we are right now. In terms of how do we make sure everybody has access to this, it's a really good question. Our hope is that because the sort of industry that we're trying to work within, this coastal protection industry exists, and there are real financial incentives for implementing coastal enhanced weathering within that basically anywhere where you have coastal erosion issues and nourishment as already being implemented as a solution, that this is something that will just naturally fold into that and be accessible there. So yeah, that's looking to the future.
As I take the microphone across the room, the other exciting thing is olivine, being such a common mineral, exists in lots of countries. So other countries already have the resource that they might need to implement it, if I'm not assuming too much.
No, great point. Yeah. I usually show a map of all the olivine reserves in the world. And for some reason I took it out of this talk, but I should have done it, particularly because there's a giant one in Washington. But yeah, you find it, some of the biggest reserves are in India, Norway, Greece, Spain. The DR actually has olivine reserves as well. So one of the reasons why we're interested in working there too. So.
Oh, well, that was actually, my name's Jackson. That was sort of my question, was on the supply side of the olivine. So you mentioned the major mine in Washington and in Norway. And so I was just thinking about, those are pretty far from the coastal zones where you're thinking of ideal beaches around the equator. So I was just wondering how that looks moving forward in terms of other countries, like you just mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, so I would say you're absolutely right that you can obviously you net capture more carbon when the transportation emissions, for example, of running your project are smaller, right? And the biggest way to do that is to get olivine from a closer source to your project area. So we're certainly in conversations with basically every major olivine mine in the world. But for right now, we're focusing on the material coming out of Norway. Even though it's not the best in terms of carbon emissions, there are some really good attributes to it. It is the biggest supplier right now, so they just have the largest capacity, largest ability to meet demand. So from just a sort of strategic point of view, it makes sense to work with that Norwegian mine. But Norway also has really high environmental regulations, and so in terms of just having confidence that, again, in this really early stage, we're using clean material that's been really carefully monitored and checked. Norway is a great place to source material from, for that matter. And then also that particular mine uses renewable energy. So again, in terms of our carbon budget, it helps in that regard. But yeah, in the future, like I said, we are basically talking to every major olivine mine in the world, and there are large reservoirs all over the place. So.
We might have time for one more question. I have a quick question then, which is obviously basaltic lava can be containing olivine. And I'm just wondering if your team or if other teams are also thinking about black sand beaches where the basaltic glass or matrix also dissolves pretty readily. So do you have any thoughts about black sand beaches?
Yeah, you mean in terms of maybe that's another potential mineral that could be used for the same purpose? Is that what you're
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right that in a lot of ways, basaltic sand could do a lot of the same things that olivine can. Basaltic glass also dissolves very, very quickly, has the ability to capture carbon, these things. There are some reasons right now that I am sort of steering away from it. There's really two main ones. So one is that basalt, it's a rock. So it's made of a lot of different minerals, right? And so there are a lot of other elements in basalt than what you get in just pure olivine, which is just a single mineral. What that means is that with all these other elements in basalt, there is a much, much, much higher abundance of what are macro and micronutrients for marine life. And so basalt can contain things like phosphorus in it, and various other nutrients. And so because of that, it's really attractive if you're interested in having a impact on biology. So in my earlier work, we were looking at using basalt in agricultural spaces. And the idea there was like adding basalt sand basically into agricultural soils. As this dissolves, it will be adding nutrients and can help promote crop growth. That's a great thing in an agricultural space. What I don't want to do is basically add that basalt to marine environments, have it add nutrients to the marine environment, and then drive algal blooms, right? So it's what is a co-benefit in one space is potentially quite harmful in another. So that's one reason. And then also just characterizing, because basalt is a rock that's made of lots of different minerals, its dissolution rate, a basalt over here is going to have a much different dissolution rate than a basalt over there. So in terms of just trying to very, very quickly understand how efficient this is at capturing carbon, basalt is just more complicated because it's just a much more complicated material. Whereas olivine, it's like one mineral, really well characterized. It's gonna be the same mineral basically everywhere you go. And so you can change things like temperature, but your starting material is the same. So any changes you see, you can say, okay, that's definitely temperature. When you're working with different basalts and different temperatures, those variables start to be confounded.
Wow, great answer. Okay, well, everybody, what a treat that we got to hear about the cutting edge state of a technology that looks so promising. I am going to ask my Gen students to stay here because technically we have a few more minutes of class. And but let's thank our speaker, Dr. Andrews, again. And everyone else.
Thank you so much for having me. I can't hear anything anymore, but it was great meeting all of you.